Thank you guys for coming. I am Nathan Fox. I'm the chair of the MFA Visual Narrative Program. Thank you. And it was my distinct pleasure and honor to be put in contact with Peppo early on before the program really got kicking. And the opportunity to have an international scholar here in our first year of the program was really fascinating, and a complete joy to have him in the studio, access to the students, and learn from him and get to know his work and what he does. Coming from Spain, Peppo is an artist, professor as well, and writer and critic at large. He's been published in many magazines that I will not completely destroy by trying to pronounce them correctly. But what we're interested in today is his illustration work, his comic work, and Peppo as a storyteller, which was great to have him here when our students were here, and also give him an opportunity to come to New York to continue research on two books that he's currently working on. So without further ado, Peppo Perez.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Nathan, for inviting me to this talk, and thank you, John McKay, for your help. Thank you, Jose Maria, for your help too, and Craig Cos. And thank you, of course, thank you all for coming. When I started to publish professionally in the late 90s, I wanted to dedicate myself to the old craft of doing comics, of being a cartoonist. I wanted to make a living from drawing comics. To that end, I drew comics as sangre, which means blood, for a large Spanish publisher who had created a line of comic books in imitation of the American ones. I accepted the assignment as such with the idea of learning the craft. Sangre was a comic book about a Native American superheroine. As you can see, one of my biggest influence at this stage was David Mazzucchelli. But I was not yet clear what kind of comics I wanted to draw. I still have not found my way. Back then, I was not even aware if I had personal issues to express with my comics, but I have. I made this 4-page story for the anthology book History of the Blues. Under this story of a bohemian blues musician who returns to his hometown, I concealed autobiographical elements about my life. At this time, I also made other short stories. As I said, at this stage, I had my doubts about what kind of comics I wanted to do. Since the Spanish market was tiny, it was very hard to make comics your bread and butter in Spain. So I seriously considered the idea of working for American comic book publishers, as other Spanish artists were already doing in Spain. I managed to draw some sample pages to get work at Marvel and DC Comics, trying to prove my skills in storytelling and drawing. I sent pencils and some full finished pages. I only tried this once. Without success. I did not insist. My doubts persisted. I did not really see myself working on a regular monthly book with assignments, scripts, in which I could not change anything, only accept them as they came and draw characters that I had not created. I felt confused at a crossroads. I didn't know which way I should take. I wanted to draw comics, but I had to decide on what kind of comics. Did I want to make a living? I was wondering, did I want to make a living drawing comics not my own, or rather to draw the comics I wanted with characters I created? I was afraid of making the wrong decision. Then came El Vecino. In the early 2000s, I began discussing the idea of collaborating on a new comic with Santiago Garcia, a writer from Madrid who lives now in Baltimore. I told him that I wanted to make a sort of a slice of life story with superheroes, and he told me an old idea he had that fit well with that concept. El Vecino is a series of 5 graphic novels, of which 3 have been published so far. El Vecino tells the story of 2 neighbors in an unidentified big city. It could be Madrid, you know, or Malaga, my hometown. Actually, in my mind, this city is kind of a sublimated mixture of both. El Vecino is about everyday life of friendship and romance, with the peculiarity that one of the protagonists, Javier, happens to be a superhero. Titan in English, is this Javier, but whenever Titan goes to do his job as a superhero, you as a reader never see him. I mean, his deeds as a superhero always remains out of sight for the reader. The first book of El Vecino is mostly a sitcom with some melancholic moments. José Ramón, the guy with the glasses, as you can see in the cover of this El Vecino Volume 1, is a small town boy who has come to the big city to study, to take the exams for civil servant. On the 3rd page of the book, he discovers that his next door neighbor, who makes strange noise late at night, is Titan, the superhero in town. Between the two, a complicated friendship emerges. One of the most important comics for both Santiago and me is the Spider-Man from the 60s and 70s. It is a comic book that marked our childhood. The tribulations of Peter Parker, Spider-Man, and his conflict between his personal life and his duties as a superhero is a theme that similarly percolates through El Vecino, although with a different tone and different situations. Javier has a different personality than Peter Parker. Sometimes some works influence us unconsciously. We didn't make these panels from El Vecino without a Spider-Man comic book open on our desk, trust me. Only later, actually, quite recently, did we discover the obvious similarities. Another influence on El Vecino was Monsieur Jean. Monsieur Jean was a series of books that French cartoonist Dupuy and Berberian developed during the 90s. At that time, Monsieur Jean was something kind of a novelty in the European market. It was no adventure or fantasy, you know, but centered on the everyday adventures of a 30-something writer. It's kind of funny comic, you know, about local customs and manners, written in a sentimental mood. More influence on El Vecino. According to Santiago, Seinfeld is the best TV show ever. That kind of sitcom, you know, focused on the everyday nothingness and its characters with peculiar dispositions, inspired a certain type of tone in El Vecino. In addition to this, El Vecino explores the social and ideological meanings of some superhero cliches. Another crucial influence on El Vecino is Love and Rockets by Jaime and Beto Hernandez, especially the work of Jaime, his personal mix of the everyday life in a urban environment, sublimated through a pop vision that sometimes includes fantasy elements. Fantasy elements which, by contrast, underline the quotidian stuff, infusing it with a special poetry. The first thing I did when I sat down to work on El Vecino was designing the main characters, as I usually do with any new comic I am developing. For Javier, the superhero titan, I chose athletic and angular features, as you can see, to highlight his superhero appearance, but also a bit stereotype. The idea was to present him as a somewhat typical spunky hunk, a sort of cross between Peter Parker, Spider-Man, and Steve Rogers, Captain America, but bearded, you know, and scruffy to reflect that trait of his personality, his informality and lack of seriousness, in contrast with the heroic stereotype represented by his physique. For José Ramón, I chose, you can see Titan, the superhero of El Vecino, Javier Titan. For José Ramón, I chose the opposite traits, as their personalities are opposite. Javier is outgoing, José Ramón is shy, Javier is casual and sassy, José Ramón is serious and disciplined. In comics, it's very important, I believe, of course, that your characters are clearly distinguished from each other. You also must be able to draw them in all poses and perspectives you need. So, if Javier would be angular and athletic, José Ramón would be chubby and round like a pear. Javier has straight hair, José Ramón sports curly hair, and he's hairy all over. Lola and Rosa would become important women in the lives of Javier and José Ramón, respectively. Again, I chose the same strategy to differentiate them. Lola, blonde hair, short and smooth. Rosa, brunette, long curly hair. Lola has something in common with Javier's physique. The two are angular, as you can see. By the same token, Rosa is curvy and has curly hair like José Ramón. It is very useful to observe real people for inspiring your character design. That was the case for Lola and Rosa, both inspired by actual girls I know. That helps to give personality to your characters, so they are less stereotyped with peculiar features and quirks based on the observation of real life. The first thing Santiago Garcia does, like many other cartoonists, me too, is not to write the full script. He draws the page first instead, dividing the action in panels and exploring the page layout. Only afterwards does he write the page. With Santiago's script in front of me, I then draw my own sketch of the page, you know, in small, tiny thumbnails for designing the page layout, the planning and composition of each panel. Then I draw a more detailed sketch of the page in the actual size it will be printed. I think this is important. Later, I made final pencils on drawing paper in a larger size than actual print format, usually at 120%. This is a final pencils. And then I ink the page. I use brush and pen with India ink. In this case, I drew almost everything with brush. Winsor and Newton, Kolinsky Sable, number 2 and 3. Then I scan the inks and do the coloring in my computer with Photoshop on a separate layer. And this is the final page. In 2007, the second volume of El Vecino was published. We wanted to change the tone, make the story not predictable, you know, surprise the reader. So in this second volume, the sitcom tone of the first book is gone. The story of El Vecino 2 is more dramatic and somber, and I wanted my art to reflect this change in tone of Santiago's script. So I tried a new, rougher graphic style, darker and dirty, more doodle-like, you know, more loose. Unlike the first book, I inked almost everything in El Vecino 2 with pen. If you change the tools, you change the look of the art. For El Vecino 2, I have to design new characters again and to redesign Javier for giving him his new look. In El Vecino 2, Javier is missing from his friends who spend the whole story looking for him. He has quit his job and ends up living on the streets as a homeless bum. There he meets other homeless people like Martin. For inspiration, I use a book of photographs of actual people who live in the streets, like this guy. Juan is another new character for El Vecino 2. He is a former boyfriend of Lola and she's involved again with him. For modeling Juan, we used the look of an actor. At that time, he was mostly unknown to us because only a few episodes of Lost have been aired. And we thought that the TV show would not have a big success. Another new character for El Vecino 2, Monica. She is a hooker, and the model we use here was precisely a prostitute from the movies. Cabiria, the character played by Giulietta Massina in Federico Fellini's The Nights of Cabiria, the wonderful Nights of Cabiria, because this is a wonderful movie. As I said before, looking to reality for inspiration can help you a lot of to give a richer texture to your comic. You know, in El Vecino 2, a big part of the story takes place where the homeless live. So we were inspired by the documentary Dark Days, directed by Mark Singer.
When I first came down in the tunnel, it looked dangerous, man. It looked real dangerous. Because even in the daytime, it was dark. And like, I was scared. I said, somewhere down the line, it can't be bad as it is up top. Because out in the street, you had kids fucking with you, you had the police fucking with you. I mean, if anybody can walk by you while you're sleeping on the bench and bust you in the head. At least down in the tunnel, you ain't gotta worry about that. Because ain't nobody in their right mind gonna come down there. So you ain't have to worry about nobody coming down there messing with you. But they not. Because they gonna be too scared to come in there.
Dark Days documents the lives of homeless people in abandoned subway tunnels in New York City, from Penn Station past Harlem, the so-called Freedom Tunnel. These slums in the subway no longer exist. In this sequence of El Vecino 2, we can see the tunnels where the homeless live. We follow one of the homeless, Martin, walking to his home in the subway tunnels. The first layout was expanded with more panels to take more time before reaching the subway slums. In comics, space is time. Here is some changes to improve the page layout to better guide the reader's eye, between the final page and the pencils of the sketch. Another source of inspiration for El Vecino 2 was a comic masterpiece that Santiago and I love, Daredevil Born Again by Frank Miller and David Mazzucchelli. Since I wanted not to hide the reference, I decided to pay homage to it, drawing Javier in the same kind of jacket Matt Murdock wore in Born Again. Simplifying elements is usually good in comics. In this case, the background. In the big panel, the final shot was different. Jose Ramon tries to call his friend, Javier Titan, who seems not to recognize him and flies off. We cannot see Titans fly because that is dogma in El Vecino. I mean, as I said before, not to show the use of his superpowers. On the final page, I drew Jose Ramon very tiny. You can see there, very tiny, to suggest his desolation while watching Titan fly away. I also simplified the background, trying not to distract the reader. That hole, this kind of hole in the center of the skyline seems to suggest a column in the air, as if in the wake of the flight of Titan. El Vecino 3. In El Vecino 3, we introduce yet again a shift in tone, a kind of mix between the humor of the first and the drama of the second. We also changed the format. This is the second book of El Vecino. This is the third. You can see the difference. We change the format, as I said, because this is a smaller size feels more intimate to the reader. 10, 15 years ago, you as an author could choose from a very few formats for your comic, standard formats, But in the 2000s, with the coming of the age of the graphic novel, you can choose the format that better suits the tone of your story. By the way, for El Vecino 4, we have changed the format once again. One source of inspiration for El Vecino 3 was Faces, a film directed by John Cassavetes we really like. And this is a new character for El Vecino 3, a corporate executive. He was designed, as you can see, after the look of John Marley, the actor John Marley in Faces. The plot in Faces is very different from El Vecino 3. However, we wanted to translate into the language of comics the peculiar way Faces is told. Faces is an experimental movie about husbands, wives, and lovers. The separation between scenes is intentionally confusing. The camera tends to stay close to the actors, often with close-ups. Besides, there are sudden changes of a scene without establishing shots that allow the audience to know where the characters are. Similarly, during the first 20-30 minutes of the film, you don't know the relationships between the characters because they are not presented as they would be in a conventional film. So you are like, what's going on here? What is the relationship between this man and this woman? Is his wife or is his lover? And this other man, who is he? Is he a friend or a relative? Gradually, you begin to understand everything as the movie progresses, but you are required to participate. You must put a lot in the movie. So, to try and figure out the relationships between the characters and the meaning of their behavior. Well, that was the effect we wanted to give to El Vecino 3. We tried to do that by first using medium shots and some close-ups in regular panels where there was usually no space for depicting the background. Second, changing the scene in the middle of the page. In a conventional comic, the change of a scene usually takes place at the end of a strip, for instance here, or at the end of the page. Well, in El Vecino 3, that does not happen. Third, using the same page layout for the entire book. All pages in El Vecino 3, all pages have the same layout, so the size of the panels could not function as an emotional indicator for the reader. Although it may seem so at first glance, the page grid is not like Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons' Watchmen, because in Watchmen there are size variations in the grid, as you can see here, that just draw attention to the fact that there is a design, there is a grid. In El Vecino 3, there is no variation at all panels are equal in size, so the layout is invisible. Our ultimate intention was to provoke in the reader a feeling of bewilderment and confusion, to get him more involved in the story without giving away too many clues about the characters' emotions. The same goes for drawing the book in black and white. The color could give you many emotional clues. However, an additional expressive element was the introduction of a single color, a red hue for Titan's costume. So we cut we could suggest the difference between the reality of the story, and the fantasy, the fiction that superhero means. For more emotional neutrality, I drew everything with a single regular pen line. I recently discovered a concept that fits into what I did. It is called dump line. Dump line. The dump line is a concept of David Mazzucchelli I read about in an interview with the show. To quote, this is a page from Batman Year One by Frank Miller and David Mazzucchelli. The lines were shading the face of Catwoman, but they didn't wrap around the curvature of her head. This is a dump line. The style of Batman Year One is that the line doesn't know what it's describing. So, in contrast, we might call this another kind of line, maybe a smart line. Comics does not have to imitate reality. Comics are drawing, and the drawing is malleable. You know, it's flexible. You can change it, even in the same page. For example, to suggest without saying a single word that a character in the story has matured. We have done quite a few short stories of El Vecino where we played with the comics conventions, formats, and formal devices. In this case, we made an entire story narrated as dailies, and Sunday newspaper comic strips. In this story, another short story of El Vecino, we played with the contrast between the tiny panels and this splash page. And in this case, the formal device was the opposition of meaning between the dialogue and what the characters really think. I mean, the thought balloon, mostly disused nowadays, you know, is a very original formal device of comics that allows a direct exposure of what the character thinks. I translate. First panel. Rosa thinks, what the fuck am I doing in bed with this guy? Rosa says, I love you, teddy bear. Jose Ramon says, I love you too. Jose Ramon thinks, oh man, do I have to take a dump? Second panel, Jose Ramon thinks, God, I love Rosa more than my own life. I can't let her slip away. Jose Ramon says, what are you doing today, honey? This is a sample of my cartoons and caricatures for elestafador.com, a digital magazine of graphic humor, co-founded by the Spanish artists Javi Rollo, Juanjo Saez, and me. In this case, the subject of the issue was rock music. I took advantage, as you can see, of the digital format for the punchline. I mean, designing the strip vertically so that the reader has to use the scroll with his computer before discover the end. Más de una vez, More Than Once, is a 4-page comic I did for an anthology. I usually draw the script too. I mean, I do not write anything before doing the page layout, as you can see here in this sketch. Here I started with a simple idea, revisiting a well-known comics mythology, a very popular icon, but from another point of view. I used small panels because I only had 4 pages and needed some length to tell the story. So I compressed the story in 4 pages with these tiny panels. For the page layout, I decided to give all panels the same size to suggest a regular and persistent rhythm. but introducing at least one big panel on each page, trying not to be monotonous. By the way, this is a formal device that Chris Ware has developed a lot in his comics. I borrowed it from him. Thanksgiving Day by Chris Ware. I tend to think of a comic page more in terms of graphic design rather than as mere drawing. Since I have to deal with quite small panels, the graphic style of the drawing should be simple as to make it readable. Hence the synthetic and iconic style. I also used two different graphic styles to represent the two walls that appear in the story. One of the styles was clearly metalinguistic, so to speak, this one. But this is a silent story without words, so you can read it without subtitles. Next. Can I continue? Second page. A tiny little subtitle is easy. Save it. Next one. Yeah. The last page. That's all, the end. I did a lot of illustrations for the press. I believe that an illustrator can bring a personal voice, an opinion, you know, not just illustrate the opinion of the guy who wrote the text piece. I like to keep it simple ideas, but with several readings, several meanings, and with visual impact. Some illustration samples. You can also play with reference to pop culture iconography. In this case, the main idea is to compare Obama to Moses, obviously, but the pop wink is really about Charlton Heston Moses in this famous film. So the reader gets turned into a complicit participant when recognizing the reference. This is our Prime Minister and the Economic Minister. Sometimes the assignment requires a more realistic approach, and in this cover with Leonard Cohen. I also like to play with different styles for illustrations depending on the idea and the subject. I'm currently working on several books. In January 2012, I defended my PhD dissertation on Frank Miller works both in film and comics. And now I am in the process of turning that dissertation into a commercial book. I'm drawing El Vecino 4, again with the script by Santiago Garcia. As we made the previous books, we realized that we are putting many personal elements in the story. Not to mention, we are exploring the social, or we are trying to explore the social and ideological meaning of the superhero genre cliches. I'm drawing this adventure Action Comics, but I would like not to say much else about this project. It's kind of secret. Memories of a Journalist is a book I'm doing in collaboration with a Spanish journalist. Since he's not a comics writer, he sends me just a literary text and I turn it into comic panels very freely. Here I am playing with visual metaphors and the contrast between the text and the symbolic meaning of the drawings. Sometimes, as in this case, I use the page layout as a visual allegory. And this is a forthcoming solo book, a kind of graphic essay on the times we live in and the financial crisis, especially about its impact on Spain. This project has been possible thanks to the editor, the Spanish editor, Isabel Cortés. This book has a double title, as we see on the cover and back cover. La crisis según, the crisis according to, and, you know, los 15 mandamientos. She reminds me of this again, a little bit. Here we can see some samples from this book. I brought some subtitles for you. But as time passed, the momentary sheet began to look more like this. Gradually, I began to understand that the crisis was not something external or accidental. Let's say it was not something like this. España, Spain is the name of the boat. It was not something like this, but rather something like this. As time went by, the more news and figures came to light, the better you could see the true perspective of the issue. Just in case you don't get the peculiar shape of this last drawing, look at this. So here I am in 2013 with several projects and several personal themes to express in my books. Moral of the fable: when you hesitate upon facing a crossroads, just keep walking. You make the road itself as you walk. That is, only on the way you will really find out what you wanted to do on your artistic path and what your personal themes are. So if you have any questions, it's your time. Thank you. It's like it's like a line regular that you don't modify the grosor, the thickness. Exactly. Thank you. The thickness of the line. So as you usually do in in the old I don't know how to say, more traditional conventional comics, and it's this kind of line, clear line, as Hergé, Tam Tam, no? Hergé, do you know Tam Tam by Hergé? Hergé. Yeah, so. And it's a kind of neutral. It's neutral. No, I like this neutrality of this line, but always depending. It always depends on what you want to do. The story. I don't believe in in the same style. You don't have to draw always in the same style. You can change, as I said before. The comics or cartoon or illustration is drawing, so the drawing is flexible. I think you should change what you need for the assignment or for the story. Or
cool, thanks.
You're welcome.
I'm wondering about your illustration. Did you use the same techniques for your illustrations that you do for your comics? So those are actually drawn in pencil and then inked and then digitally colored. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
I don't use the the graphic table. No. I do the pencils and then the ink by hand. Then I scan. I usually do the coloring on my computer. Yeah, the same. Yeah, the same as in my comics. Yeah.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
I love your graphics, by the way. I love your whole presentation. Your title design and everything is really nice.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Oh, thanks. Okay, so I noticed that the books are different sizes and they have different typefaces on them and stuff. So does that mean that you guys sort of consider them with some amount of independence from each other? What's your thinking behind that?
Yeah, it's a problem when we finish the whole story. When the 5 volumes. It would be a problem because different sizes. So I don't know how we can put in a collection book because the different sizes, but we thought that especially in the case of El Vecino 3, we thought that it was necessary for the tone of the story. So, you know, this is a more graphic album, more based, you know, more based in the graphics. But this is, as you can, you know, as I said and showed before, this is more kind of graphic novel, like a novel, you know. And the drawing, I wanted the drawing to be invisible, because anyway, it's what I think the story, this Santiago's script needed.
Hi, I'm really interested to know how being in New York City has influenced your work, even though it was such a short amount of time.
I think a lot, yeah. Well, I have been 3 months right now in New York City. I came here on late June, so I had a lot of experience here, and I also drew. By the way, I have some pages I did here, in case you want to see.
I'll move the table out here.
Yeah, on the table. Yeah, of course. Come on. Come on here. Come on.
Did you
No, she
finish
waits.
answering the question about New York? Did you have more?
Yeah,
to say about
it's you know, it's an awesome city. Maybe I think the city had I changed. I have changed a lot through this experience. I think more it's more about people. More this. I think this city is unique because all these people from everywhere, and you know, with some so different language. I think, for instance, I think I said this to John. By contrast, London seems to me provincial. Provincial, yeah. By contrast with New York City. So this is a great experience for every artist. So, go.
My question was, have you ever done any animation or thought
No,
about?
no, I didn't.
Yeah, for when we had that explosion, when you had the rocket ship in your come there, for a moment I thought the whole thing was going to animate, but
It was just a zoom in the PowerPoint.
In terms of a lot of the academic, or even as a professor, and you know, in terms of the theory and the theorist and evaluation, does that ever come into play in self-criticism while you're working, in terms of, you know, like trying to construct something in your storytelling? I mean, has that theory and that academic mind, have you ever had any play, you know, push and pull with that in terms of struggle or development? Has it been an asset you know, how does that play against each other, you know, with the artist and the theorist?
Yeah, yeah. I think, in my opinion, I think every artist is a theorist, or should be a theorist, because you have to think a lot in order to do your work, and when you do the work, when you really are you know, making your piece or your comic or whatever, or your paint, you keep thinking. You keep thinking about the theory. So the research work is in my opinion, once again, is very important, because reading theory, you can improve your work, you can expand your work to other, how do you say, to different places you are not, has not been
Exposed.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's helped you evolve.
Yeah.
And your work evolve.
Mm.
I'm curious, and I guess I'm curious in terms of storytelling, and also too how the Vecino.
Yeah,
How that has evolved, how the narrative itself, in terms of storytelling. I mean, how has that experience, or what is your experience of that in terms of Volume 1, which seemed like a very straightforward, two neighbors, hero, off we go. But now you're really starting to tackle some larger character issues, the realization that this is really you. I mean, how can you speak to that evolution as a creator?
Yeah, it's what you think. You're right. So once again, you have to walk the way. You have to walk the way to discover these things, and to discover that this is a work more personal than you think when you began. There is another factor, another point, very important, I think, because you are doing the work as you are growing, you are getting older. So this also is reflected in your work, I think, or should be. Okay,
Pepo,
that's it.
thank you very much.
Thank you.